Hello, and welcome to Shep's Chat 901, Voting and Elections. Maybe now that you guys have made your own chats, you will appreciate the time and effort that goes into these a little bit more, but probably not. That's okay anyways. All right, here's your learning targets for this chapter. You guys are going to be basically getting an overview of the historical elections, the restrictions on elections, and the different ways that people can vote. What we don't cover in my Shep's Chat, you guys will cover in your own individual lessons to the class. So when we go to listen to those, it will be important that you guys take notes and know what they're talking about. All right, so your chapter starts off this week with a what if on what if voting on the internet became universal. So what if instead of having to go to a voting booth and do stuff like that, we could actually just log on, type in some type of identification code, and vote that way. There are some benefits that are mentioned in your chapter, such as reducing the cost of voting, which there's quite a bit of cost associated with voting between the paper ballots, paying the people to be there all day, paying people to count them, etc. But one of the things that we kind of have to think about, especially with anything with the internet, is that as smart as the good guys are, typically there's bad guys that are smarter. The bad people tend to pay more. So the smarter you are, the more you can get paid if you're on the naughty side. Christian, don't tell Evan that though, okay? All right, so there could be fraud. So if people could get online and vote and use other people's ID numbers or find out other people's ID numbers like they find out passwords, that could definitely be an issue. We've seen in the news quite a bit lately about the Russian involvement in our elections. So if we could see that becoming an issue if we were all voting online, and then the fact that it would disenfranchise voters. And then disenfranchise voters means it makes some voters ineligible or unable to vote. So when people are disenfranchised, they cannot vote. In this case, think about the elderly, because if my grandma had to vote on the internet, that would be the end of her voting. She would never do it. Or people that are poor and don't have access to the internet. So you start to disenfranchise people if you do that. Today, most states allow it in some form. Most of the time, that is for absentee ballots, but not for general purposes. There are some states that do allow it for general purposes, and that should be covered in one of your mini lessons that you guys are going to do. All right, the importance of open and free elections. So in the United States, we have what are called open and free elections. So there are opposition candidates. If you were going to be voting in North Korea, because they do actually vote in North Korea. The problem is that there's no opposition candidate. So you go into the voting booth and it's like, who would you like to vote for? Would you like to vote for Kim Il-sung, or would you like to vote for, oh, well, yep, that's your only choice. Some places you are coerced into staying away from the polls. So they have a stronger military. There might be a military presence at the polls that keeps you away. And it's also a way to guarantee a majoritarian form of government. So even though some people say we don't have a majoritarian form of government because everybody doesn't go out and vote, everybody technically that's over the age of 18 and not a felon could go out and vote. That is their choice not to. So it's really important that in the United States we have open and free elections, because that's something that a lot of other countries don't have, even if they have elections on face. The growth in eligible voters over the last few years has not been giving the advantage to white people. So over the last few years, the biggest change in growth has been from the Hispanic community going up 17%, the Asian community going up 16%. During this time, the white community has only gone up 2%. So the voting eligible population has gone up most for Hispanics. What should this tell us that we already know about the way that people vote? That the voting base would become more liberal. So eligible voters are not people that actually vote. So that's important to remember, that just because there's more eligible Hispanics does not mean that Hispanics are going to the polls in big numbers. We did see more people going to the polls of minorities when Barack Obama was being elected, but that kind of went away again when Democrats were voting for Hillary Clinton. So they can go to the polls. The question is, will they go to the polls, and what will help influence them to get them there? All right, So, in general, Americans really, really, really do not show up in elections of any sort. If it's a presidential election, you will see more voter participation, especially in the 1960s. You saw some more voter participation there. That was a really controversial time in our country's history. But overall, we stick right around 50-55% in presidential elections and then around 35% in non-presidential elections. And then when you're talking about local and state elections, you're going to see even less people. So if there's a municipal election in April in the town of Sharon, maybe only 80 or 90 people will show up. When it's a presidential election, you might get 400 or 500 people to show up. It just depends on how important it is or how controversial the topic is. So, why is it so low? Well, sometimes people are just okay with the status quo. They think that it's not that bad. In some cases, it can be hard to register. At the very least in Sharon, it is not all that hard to register. You can show up on the day of election, and that's a state of Wisconsin thing. That's not everywhere, but you can show up on the date of election and register to vote as long as you have a form of ID and proof of residence. Some people just don't want to learn about the issues. They don't care enough. They don't feel like their opinions matter. And so they don't want to know about the issues and they don't want to vote. In some cases, we can blame it on the uninformative media. So they can tell us what to think, not tell us what to think, aggravate us to the point where we don't want to be a part of it. Negative campaigning is kind of going to be the same thing, where we just get tired of listening to people bash each other and we don't see where it's a positive no matter who we vote for. There's something called the rational ignorance effect, which says I don't want to learn about it because my vote will not matter. I don't have any incentive to vote. There are quite a few people that actually feel this way about the presidency once they realize that their popular vote does not elect the president, rather the electoral college does. But your electoral college is still affected by your popular vote. So in Wisconsin, if more people vote for Democrats, then our electoral candidates, our electoral votes would go towards the Democrats. An overall cynicism with the political system. Um, People don't want to go and vote because they feel so negative about everything within our political system. And we've seen that one of the major issues is that people feel cynical about our political system in general right now. So that might be a reason why we're seeing the voting base get even lower and lower. This is kind of a dumb thing. If you don't like the way that the government is running, what you should be out there doing is actively participating in it and trying to change it. You need to be voting. You need to be looking for the next best candidate that's out there. And then another issue is really to think about, is it that low? So the voting age population includes non-citizen immigrants, people that can't vote, and felons who can't vote. That is over 20 million people in our population that we include in our voting age population that are technically not allowed to vote at the polls. So, elected by a majority is what our country is supposed to go by. Well, not really, because most of the time our presidents don't get even 40% of the votes. In the last 85 years, the highest vote has been 37.8% of the eligible voters voted for President Johnson, and that was really just because people were interested in politics after Kennedy was killed. Other than that, every other president has gotten less than that of the majority vote. So there's going to be third-party candidates that are going to take people away from there. You do not have to have that high of the overall population of eligible voters to win the presidency. 37.8 is about as high as it gets. Sometimes you can win the popular vote and then not win the presidency. So people win the electoral college, but they don't win the presidency. This is a controversial issue. Once again, if you've been watching the news at all, that you would have heard about this because this most recently happened in the last election with Donald Trump. One of you guys did an amazing job on your current event this week, and you talked about how Donald Trump once stated that the Electoral College was a horrible thing that was going to bring down our country, and yet that is exactly what got him elected. Other times that this has happened is for John Quincy Adams, Rutherford B. Hayes, Benjamin Harrison, and George Bush. All right, factors that influence who votes. Age. For a long time, the typical voting age was 21. We now have the constitutional amendment that says that if you are old enough to fight, you are old enough to vote. So we moved it down to 18. However, the problem is most of you still don't vote. Um, a lot of people that are 18 to 21 don't feel that it is relevant to you. An exception for this was during the two elections for President Barack Obama, especially the first one. A lot of young people bought into the hope and change that Barack Obama promised. And whether you feel that happened or not, those people did go out and vote in pretty big numbers. Your education, the more education you have, the more likely you are to vote. Your minority status, if you are white, you are 66.1% likely to vote, African Americans 64%, Latinos 49%, and Asians 47%. Your income, this should not be too surprising, just like the education one. The more money you have, the more likely you are to vote. And then your statewide competition. So if you live in a really, really, really red state, so your state's completely conservative, head to toe, you are probably not going to feel like it's that important for you to go out and vote. However, if you live in a purple state, such as Wisconsin, you might feel a little bit more important to go out and vote because you know that it could be a close election and that your vote might actually matter and be the difference. All right, over time, we know that there have been some legal restrictions on voting. When the Constitution was first passed and ratified, it was only white property owning males that were able to vote. And that lasted until 1850, and then you didn't necessarily have to own property. In 1870, it was extended to African American males only by law. In practice, African Americans, specifically in the South, were not actually able to vote until the 1960s in large numbers. In the 1920s, 1920 to be specific, with the 19th Amendment, we extend suffrage to women. And in 1971, we extend it to 18-year-olds. What would have happened or been happening right before that that would make us think we should let 18-year-olds vote? The Vietnam War, hopefully you guys said that. So the fact that we have the Vietnam War leads us to say if they were all old enough to go over there and die, then they are probably old enough to vote for the people that are going to send them over there to die. All right, who still cannot vote? Well, most of the time felons cannot vote, non-citizens cannot vote, the mentally incompetent cannot vote, and those under 18. The mentally incompetent, because I'm a little more like looking into those types of issues these days. So basically, if somebody is going to be your guardian for the rest of your life, then they are not allowed to vote. So if when James turns 18, Kenny and I want to sign papers that say we would like to remain his legal guardian and be responsible for the majority of his decisions, then he would not be allowed to vote because he wouldn't be competent enough to take care of himself. He's not competent enough to make those types of decisions. All right, in comparison, there are some countries where you are required to vote. It is compulsory. Do you think that we're a country that should be compulsory to vote? I think if you're going to be in a free country, one of your decisions is that you have the freedom and ability to decide whether you want to vote or not. Some countries have much higher turnout than we do in the United States. In Belgium, they have 93% of the people show up. But there's other countries that are lower than us, such as Switzerland, India, South Africa. If you think about it, Belgium is a pretty small country, pretty small population. They probably are going to feel like they have more of an impact than somebody in the United States. They're for sure going to feel like they have more of an impact than somebody that is one of the 6 billion people or whatever ridiculous amount it is that lives in India. All right, registering to vote. How can you register to vote? Well, you have to be able to prove that you're a citizen. You have to be able to prove that you're 18 and older. You have to be able to prove that you are a resident of the state that you are trying to vote in or the village that you are trying to vote in. And then from state to state, it depends when you can register up until. In the state of Wisconsin where you live, you can register up until the day of election. You can walk into the voting booth on the day of election and say that I would like to register. The Motor Voter Bill, which was passed in 1993, helps people learn about the requirements for voting, and it's a bill that requires states to provide voter registration materials when they receive or renew a driver's license, and it allows voters to register by mail, and voter registration forms have to be available at a wider variety of places. This is in an effort to get more people eligible to vote or at least registered to vote. All right, that's where we're going to end this Shep's chat. We'll pick off with the last few slides. I think there's 5 more on the next one. Thanks, guys.